to the former surplus country. And he suggests that this is a balancing mechanism. Now, of course, if you adopt the equilibrium theory of price, which we have spent some time on and argued against, and our preference following Karl Menger is the disequilibrium theory. But if you are on the basis of the equilibrium theory, then this sounds very plausible. The problem is that in practice it didn't work, because early on, I think in the 1970s, there was this imbalance between the United States and Japan. Japan being the surplus country and the United States the deficit country, and they put pressure, the Americans put pressure on the Japanese to revalue, increase the value of their yen, and that will bring the balance about. Well, it never happened. It got worse and worse and worse. And in the case of Germany also, Germany was the surplus country, United States the deficit country, and there was a revaluation of the Deutschmark upwards, and everybody expected the balance to re-establish itself. It never happened. And so that meant the theory of Friedman is wrong. It just doesn't, in reality, it doesn't happen that way. Now, I have always laughed at this, or I should have cried actually. It was so utterly naive to come up with this theory. I think another analogy is much more appropriate, because a devaluation, in effect, the US dollar was devalued again, and as they did devalue, the Japanese exports kept increasing, and the American exports to Japan kept shrinking, and the same with Germany, same with other countries. Now, here's the explanation, and I find that very convincing. When you devalue your own currency, this is equivalent to mutilating yourself, or self-inflicted wounds, such as cutting off a finger or cutting off an arm. That's what devaluation is. It cannot possibly make you stronger in international trade, but it will make you weaker. So you want to compete with your opponents. It's like a sportsman preparing for the race, and just before the race mutilates himself or herself. Well, that's not hard to predict the outcome of the race. The country causing itself this damage will lose, and the other will have the advantage, which kept the stability of the currency. So the theory of Friedman is completely wrong on every account. And just immediately before 1971, Friedman prevailed. He came out with this theory of balancing trade through allowing the currency to get devalued. He developed this, but at this early stage, he was laughed out of the lecture hall. People said this is crazy. But then, as 1971 approached, more and more people took a second look at Friedman's theory and said, gee, that might just work, so let's try that. And that's what happened. The introduction of the floating currencies in 1971, which was an immediate consequence of the closing of the gold window by President Nixon. And this, we know, led to our present difficulties. It was exactly 40 years ago when this happened, and this 40 years caused a lot of damage, and now we are actually staring in the face of a collapse of the world monetary system. It may not be obvious to everybody yet because the governments try to hide the facts and withhold information from the public, and this is very unfortunate because when the next explosion, like 2008, will happen, then the vast majority of people will be surprised that they are completely unprepared. So that's where we stand. Now, Friedman, in his book, talks about the future of irredeemable currencies. And he does admit, to his credit I say, he does admit that it's not a foregone conclusion that irredeemable currencies will survive indefinitely. But on the other hand, he says it's no longer true what Irving Fisher, an American economist, said in 1911, which was basically that irredeemable paper money has always been a curse to the country employing it. And Friedman says this is no longer true. In other words, with his addition to economics and others, we now have enough knowledge and expertise and so on to manage the irredeemable currency, such as the irredeemable dollar, irredeemable pound sterling, and the euro as well. Because with this knowledge, we can manipulate things, interest rates, money supply, etc., etc. And as a result, we have the new millennium, where gold and silver no longer will have a significant role to play. Instead, the irredeemable currencies will guide our destinies. Well, of course, we always said that that's not going to happen, and we have so much more reason today. They say this, but of course, Friedman is no longer with us. He died, so we cannot answer our arguments. But all this body of knowledge, so-called, which had been built up during the past 40 years, is not going to help us out. In fact, it's just going to make things worse. And so much power is concentrated in the hands of governments, central banks, that they will fight tooth and nail any initiative to change the course of the history, and unfortunately that's what it looks today. The disaster cannot be averted. It's going to be fulfilled, which is very unfortunate. And we just stand there helplessly waiting for the worst to happen. So I think I will sign off here and give you a chance for discussion.
Any comments
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I understand how by cutting out bimetallism, the Chinese economy was undercut when the price of silver dropped. Obviously, their international position was reduced. So how did this work with Roosevelt buying silver? Wouldn't that bring up the price of silver? Could you elaborate on that, please?
You're talking about silver?
Yes. You said Roosevelt initiated a buying plan for silver. Why did that hurt China? Wouldn't it bring Chinese wealth higher because they had lots of silver? I'm not clear on this.
You see, the silver was part of the monetary system. It was money. In China, they didn't mint coins as such. It was a Western custom. They had these boats or shoes, silver. I explained. I meant to bring a photo of how this looks, and in the last minute I didn't. But you can look up in Wikipedia and other places how the Chinese money looked like. It didn't look like our coins at all. It was mostly these irregular pieces. All right. Now, what effect the decision of Roosevelt had, that he started buying silver on the advice of his economic advisors, the argument was that if you keep buying silver, the world price of silver will rise and it will pull up the international economy. Prices will rise in general, not just silver, but other prices. This was the theory. And we don't have to ask whether this succeeded or not, because the effect on China was different. Because China was on silver standard, and as the international price of silver kept going up, there was a drain of silver from China to the West. And that was lethal to the Chinese economy, because that meant less money and falling prices, deflation, depression. unemployment, all the usual consequences, unemployment, serial bankruptcies, and general poverty, increasing poverty.
So when the silver came out of China, what did the Chinese get in return? They must have traded it, they didn't just give it away. Did they bring in Western goods, or what did they trade their silver for? As their
Well, I think it's just.
Oops.
It's just a simple mechanism that silver, like water, flows to the lowest point where it can. And silver left the country, left China, because it was bid up the price. That's why silver moved. And that's why China was losing silver. Yes?
It was paid up with what?
Pardon?
Professor, what we're asking is that if domestic Chinese are sending silver outside of China, what are they getting in exchange? Are they keeping it in United States dollars, gold,
I think paper.
paper?
Well, they didn't have any need for that. I mean, throughout history, we observed, starting it in the 19th century, even earlier, China didn't have any need for the Western goods, so China wanted silver. Now, here, this is a case where the silver was bid away, but I think it was still true that China didn't, but once the silver started flowing on its own, spontaneously, you couldn't stop it.
Maybe it was replaced by gold,
That's a possibility.
They already had for dollars and more dollars.
Well, gold.
No.
Dollar is gold. It's being replaced by dollars, which is gold.
Which was not circulating in China.
Well, it's an IOU on gold.
An IOU in gold. Okay.
All right. So this was a disaster, and this is acknowledged by economists all over the world that it was a very foolish decision on the part of Roosevelt. But I mean, all his advisors were very unsound thinkers. He had lots of economic advisors, but no sound economic advisors given by them. These were like economic historians, or agricultural economists, or labor economists. But the need is sound monetary economists, which at that time still existed. Now this is 1935. They died out. It's a
Tragedy.
it was an endangered species, and then it was helped to put to sleep.
Louis?
The reason why this caused great misery and etc. in China was because they were on a silver standard. Right? That's why. I mean, if they had been on a gold standard or another standard, it would not have had the same effect.
It wouldn't.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the reason it had this effect in China.
Yes.
But what do you think? Okay, Roosevelt had bad or poor advice, but what was his true intention? I Did the US want to replenish their stocks of silver, or did they just want to...
Well, that was the theory of the two men. Pearson was the name of one, and Warren. They were both agricultural economists, and they were strictly, in terms, their theories were strictly based on this supply-demand equilibrium theory of price. And they also extended this by saying if you can raise one particular commodity's price, then the others will follow. And which is not necessarily true, but in agriculture it may be observed more often than elsewhere. So they just persuaded Roosevelt that this is the thing to do. There is one price which you can manipulate, the price of silver. That's the obvious thing. Completely ignoring what effect it would have on China. I mean, there are lots of books which go into this question, all the details. And if you're interested, it's worthwhile. Because, talking about blunders which politicians have made over the past 100 years, it's endless, but this is one of the biggest. To reduce a country which is potentially so great as China to an economic dwarf is just amazing by manipulating the price of silver. So, yes.
I think Roosevelt was sympathetic to the communists. Him and Uncle Joe, Uncle Stalin. So maybe there was some intention to not help the nationalist Chinese, but the other guys. So,
possibly.
Mark?
So here we are, 160 years about after the Opium Wars, and have kind of a similar situation with a huge trade imbalance, but this time it's not opium which is being exported to China, but paper dollars.
Oh yeah.
So China has caught up a lot, but it is still under a huge paper standard itself, and there's, I think, a lot of misallocations. Would you dare to give some predictions on the Chinese economy during the coming crisis and coming years?
Yeah, a lot of commentators are pessimistic about China. They are predicting a huge depression coming up in China. As far as I'm concerned, I don't see that at all, because the Chinese are hardworking and frugal, and even if they lose a large part of their paper reserves, which they keep in dollars, but now also they diversified into other currencies, and they are going to lose on that account. They might gain even more on the on the metal account, silver and gold. It's unprecedented in the history of any communist country that the government is encouraging the population to hoard silver and gold. It's unprecedented. In fact, the communist government confiscated the silver and gold of the people, starting with the Russians and following with all the others. By the way, that was also the case. It's not specifically communist, it's specifically under dictatorships. Hitler also started his rule by, if not confiscating, but at least forbidding trade in gold and silver. And they were actually Hitler and his regime was more effective than the communists.
Tony?
Professor, I am a question. You have changed, in my opinion, correct me if I'm wrong, you have changed your thinking about the causes of silver demonetization, or not?
Changed?
Your thinking about the causes of silver monetization.
Yeah.
Demonetization.
Yeah, I did.
Demonetization.
About bimetallism and silver demonetization, closing the mint to silver. I've changed.
Okay. Because I read in your paper, Wither Gold, that the demonetization of silver by market forces was a logical consequence.
Yeah, I no longer believe that.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
I've got a quick comment about Milton Friedman's theory. He said that, under a gold standard you have the surplus and deficit country, and gold moves. Prices rise in the surplus country, and they fall in the deficit country. But for those that have attended earlier courses, you'll know that that's not the way that it worked. Instead of going into the movement did not affect the price of the goods, it affected the volume of goods on offer via changing the discount rate. So the discount rates would change, and wherever discount rates were moving in a lower direction, you'd have a consequent expansion in the amount of consumer goods available. So Friedman got that wrong. So the premise for his theory was wrong. So obviously when you have this idea that floating currencies can do the same thing, well, they were never replicating what the gold standard did anyway. So what happens is that countries that build up surpluses, they exacerbate the problem because they invest in the securities of their debtors, which allows them to continue this vicious circle just by continuing the trajectory in interest rates, which is downwards anyway. So this is a big sort of logical this was erroneous from the beginning, from Friedman's.
What you say is absolutely right. However, Friedman was not the only one, because that is still the standard interpretation how the gold standard operates. That there are big flows of gold back and forth between surplus and deficit countries. But if you examine the record, you will find that actually very, very little gold moved under the 19th century gold standard, which was of course centered in London, and the Bank of England was managing it. And economists are still wondering how on earth the Bank of England could manage the world gold standard on a tiny basis of gold, because the Bank of England had very little gold, which goes to show that there's no way to predict how much credit, sound credit, you can build on a certain fixed amount of gold. Because if this gold starts moving fast enough, then the amount of credit you can build on it increases accordingly. And that's all good credit, you know. It's private, it's not government, not inter-government credit.
You mean real bills? You mean real bills there?
It's credit built on gold gold which is circulating, you see. And you can see miracles happening there, as in the case of the Bank of England, managing the world trade through real bills, all gold. These are bills payable in gold within 90 days, and the amount of world trade in 1913 was so high, the level of international trade, that I think it was sometime in the 1970s that the world could catch up with its previous record. It's amazing. I mean, you would think that with the addition of things which didn't exist in 13, television and high-powered cars and jet engines and what have you, the level of world trade reached the same level as it was in 1913 very quickly after World War, and it's not the case at all. It took a long time. And this is a very significant observation, that there is no set limit of credit, sound credit you can build on a certain amount of gold. Because the gold circulation, if it expands, that could increase the credit accordingly.
About the intention to ruin China, I don't know whether you remember, but in our childhood, people were speaking in Hungary about a yellow danger, that the Chinese would invade the world. Perhaps there were rumors about that in America as well.
You think it's still a danger?
No.
I think the Chinese people are very peaceful. I mean, look at this.
In our childhood, this was a serious saying in Hungary.
Even in our adulthood,
danger.
not just childhood, also in our adulthood.
Then I didn't hear to speak about this now.
I mean,
It can be, but I didn't hear.
well, anyhow, this
But
Chinese danger or yellow danger or what have you is always there. Some politicians will always exploit the irrational fear of the Chinese or Japanese. I don't share that.
When the Chinese started to come to Hungary, people were against them because I think first the criminals came to our country, and there were when after the change of regime, when they started to come to Hungary, there were companies where only 11 directors were, no employee, only directors. And And people didn't know that the Chinese were wise and hardworking.
But just because there were only 11 directors, it doesn't make it criminal. Well, I don't know. We have been to China. I liked what I saw, and it's a great country. There's no denying it. They have learned a great deal. I wish we had learned correspondingly, but I think we are just staying behind. I mean, the United States was the world's leading creditor country in the 1980s. And they lost that role, and it took just a couple of decades for China.
It's their fault, because they transferred the whole industry to China.
Oh, there's more than that. That was part of it too. But be it as it may, I think it was a small miracle what China did. And we'll see. Because what the Americans are doing presently is just running into catastrophe and disregarding the interest of others and even their own. The Americans will suffer most when they have to retrench. This is going to be very, very painful for the Americans, and you can blame it on the American political leadership squarely. And they are just completely unable to learn from their own mistakes.
Unwilling.
We had this idea that weak dollar is a strong dollar, because that's the thing. So in order to make the dollar so stronger, you have to make it weaker. You have to devalue it, you have to push down the value, and that's happening right in front of our eyes. And we see how America is losing ground as a result of it. No, it's still the same. Of course, they don't admit it, that the dollar, but this QE1, QE2 is just another name for devaluing the dollar. A disastrous policy. If they stabilize the dollar before China stabilizes its yuan in terms of gold, then they lost the game. If China does that first, I think you will see a different world. China with us, gold or silver money is going to be very, very strong economically. And that's the way I see it.
Any more questions? Comments? No?
I'm going to ask another one.
Go on, Ian.
Professor, do you expect China to go back to a silver standard?
Could. It suggests, what's happening in the silver market suggests to me that the Chinese are manipulating the silver. In other words, they don't want silver to run to, I don't know, hundreds of dollars an ounce, which it could. They would rather take the time. Now, whether it's because they want to give a chance to the poorest Chinese peasant that he should have a few silver coins in his possession, or they are actually putting a strategy into effect which would harm the Western countries more. I don't know.
Both. They create a stronger middle class at no cost.
See, everything that the Americans did was wrong. They should have simply copied what the Chinese did. The Chinese developed their silver refining capacity enormously, so that
When did the
10 or 15 years ago.
Okay.
So that if you had any quantity of silver to be refined, you had to take it to China, because that's where the capacity. The Americans should have done the same. They didn't. Okay. Then the Chinese started buying silver and encouraging their people to, and make it available in every small village, so that the peasants far away from the big cities could also have access to silver. Now in America, there's no. I mean, Mexico, yes. Hugo Salinas Price. He has an outlet in the smallest Mexican village. You can buy and sell silver coins. But in the United States, certainly it didn't spread out into the villages. You have to have a sizable city. And then the Chinese believe in financing trade in terms of gold and silver. The Americans didn't. So, as a result, the American position becomes less and less effective against the Chinese. I think that's a problem, or the problem is coming and coming soon.
Any more questions? Rudy?
Just a little comment on this. I deal with Chinese people selling machinery, building machinery, and it comes out when you talk to them that the back of their mind is the peasant in the back country. They're thinking about that and bringing wealth or work or whatever. And if it's not altruistic, it's certainly preemptive of revolution. So they are thinking that, no question.
Any more questions, comments? Well, I think on that note we will adjourn for the day. Thanks very much, Professor.
Thank you.